Hey everybody, this is an essay or article by Udo Gehrmann, who apparently was a lecturer in the university, who, uh, Udo Gehrmann lectured in history at the University of Halle. This journal's from 1992, so I'm going to assume that he is no longer doing that. Alright, so here we go. Trotsky and the Russian Social Democratic Controversy over Comparative Revolutionary History. The revolutionary outlook of the Russian Social Democrats was forged in the events of 1905 and 1917, but also contained a, quote, Russian interpretation of the history of modern revolutions. The historical parallels and analogies which were used served not only as tailor-made arguments for the credibility of new ideological systems, but also, even more, as an indicator of the changing conceptions of modernization amongst the Russian Social Democrats at the beginning of the 20th century. In international research into the life and work of Lev Davidovich Trotsky, contributions on individual aspects of the general subject matter are relatively few. Footnote. See, for example, Lubitz, Trotsky Bibliography, a classified list of published items about Leon Trotsky and Trotskyism. Published in Munich and New York, 1988. I'm going to look this up. It says some 1,900 new items have been added to this revised edition, bringing the total to over 5,000 items on Trotsky and Trotskyism. The scope encompasses all aspects of Trotsky's life and work, his role in history, his ideas, his legacy, and his influence. Coverage includes Trotskyist as well as anti-Trotskyist and Western, as well as Soviet publications. The materials are arranged by subject and include books, reports, dissertations, pamphlets, essays, memoirs, speeches, interviews, and more. 2 appendices include the very latest and forthcoming items. 4 indices offer numerous access points to the individual entries, which are identified by number. For political scientists, historians, and Soviet specialists, back to the text and footnote. This is doubtless partly because Trotsky represented a taboo subject for research among Soviet historians concerned with problems relating to how Russian social democracy incorporated previous experiences of revolution, such as V.S. Alexei Popov, V.M. Dalin, B.S. Ittenberg, M.S. Persov, V.G. Revnenko, and others. I'm going to look up these names. See if anything comes up. I'm really doubting they will. None for V.S. Alexeyev Popov. Is there anything for V.M. Dalin? Nothing for V.M. Dalin. It says that he was at the Institute of Red Professors and lived from 1902 to 1985, but that's about it. B.S. Ittenberg. Not seeing anything for him. M.S. Persov. Not seeing anyone anything for her, for this person. VG Revunenko. Not seeing anything for them either. Okay. Didn't think I would, but I would have not felt good unless I did. The first attempts at working over these, quote, blank spots in Russian intellectual history were produced in the West by, amongst others, A. von Borka, R. Jahn, and W. Scharlau. Didn't see anything for the first name, the E. von Borka. Not seeing for any, for R. Jan. W. Scharlau, that seems like a name that I might have seen before. Yeah. Yeah, not seeing for this W. Scharlau either. Footnote. Borka, die Ursprünge des Bolschewismus, die jakobinische Tradition in Russland und die Theorie der revolutionären Diktatur. Looked that up, didn't see anything. Jan Lenin's Verhältnis zur Geschichte dargestellt, vornehmlich am Beispiel der Französischen Revolution. Don't see any descriptions of this book. And finally, yeah, it's just an article by W. Scharlau, Parvis and Trotsky, 1904 to 1914. I think Scharlau might have been the author of the book on Parvis, so that's why I might have recognized the name. Anyway, end footnote. The fact, however, is unavoidable. Whereas in the East, the criminalization of Trotsky initiated by Stalin resulted in a significant taboo area in historical studies, in the West, the highlighting of Trotsky as leader of the anti-Stalinist opposition clearly resulted in a one-sided emphasis on the 1920s and 1930s. This is most evident in the work of Oscar Answeiler, J. Bergman, Isaac Deutscher, David Law, and others. Footnote: see the article by O. Answeiler, Der Thermidor der Russian Revolution. J. Bergman's article, The Perils of Historical Analogy, Leon Trotsky on the French Revolution, published in the Journal of the History of Ideas, 1987, which I've been meaning to read. Isaac Deutscher's article, The French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, Some Suggestive Analogies. And D. Law, Trotsky and Thermidor. I'm pretty sure that's David Law. Anyway, end footnote. Thus, the contributions under discussion only touch on and leave otherwise outside of their scope the question of the revolutionary conceptions of the young Trotsky and his position in the turmoil of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, on the eve of, during, and the years after the revolution of 1905 to 1907. This controversy was given a strong impetus at the London Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903. Footnote: see Isaac Deutscher's The Prophet Armed, Trotsky, 1879 to 1921, and Jan, Lenin's Verhältnis, and Bergman's The Perils of Historical Analogy. End footnote. From the point of view of the history of ideas, the program which was agreed at this Congress established the framework both for the assessment of modern revolutions within a unified theoretical framework, and also for the overdue democratic revolution expressed in the minimum program, and for the proletarian revolution in Russia, maximum program, which was already under discussion. But this led, in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, to a sharp dispute on the basic question of whether this outlook was based in any sense on historical experiences, or whether these experiences had been wrongly evaluated and interpreted. Around 2 decades later, Martynov, Alexander Samoilovich Piker, who Trotsky considered to be a, quote, main critic of the theory of permanent revolution, end quote, in the years 1905 to 1923, recalled the beginning of this controversy in these words, quote, it seemed to me that in London, I had suddenly been transported into the French Convention of 1793. To such a degree did the contributions of the party delegates remind me of the behavior of the Montagnards. Here, at the party congress, I asked myself the question, can the history of the French Convention at the end of the 18th century be repeated in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century? End quote. Martynov, Alexander Samoilovich Piker. I'm going to look this person up. Wikipedia says Alexander Martynov lived from 1865 to 1935 and was a leading Menshevik politician before the Russian Revolution of 1917, and for a few years after the revolution, a critic of Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Parenthesis, 1923, end parenthesis. The son of a Jewish timber merchant, Martynov joined the People's Will in 1884 and was arrested 3 times in 1886 to 1889 and deported for 10 years to the Kolyma region. Alexander Martynov became a Marxist after his release, and joined the Social Democrats in 1899. In 1901, Alexander Martynov emigrated to Switzerland and joined the Union of Russian Social Democrats abroad as chief editor of the magazine Robochaya Delo. He was leader of the economist faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Alexander Martynov proposed that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party should be guided by spontaneous initiatives by Russian workers and confront the government on specific issues of pay and working conditions, where there was a reasonable chance of achieving specific improvements, because, quote, the economic struggle is the most widely applicable means of drawing the masses into active political struggle, end quote. Alexander Martynov. Martynov accused the editors of Iskra of focusing too much on long-term political issues that were too far removed from the workers' immediate experience. Lenin devoted whole sections of his pamphlet What is to be Done, published in 1902, to attacking, quote, economists for being, quote, determined always to follow behind the movement and be its tail, ... end quote. Lenin. Specifically, Lenin said that Martynov's error was thinking that, quote, it is possible to develop the class political consciousness of the workers from within, end quote. When, according to Lenin, quote, class political consciousness can be brought to the workers only from without, end quote. Lenin. Martynov was one of two, quote, economist delegates to the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Congress in Brussels in July 1903 and gave a lengthy response to Lenin's attack, claiming that Lenin's reliance on professional revolutionaries, quote, opens a deep fissure between the leading elements of the movement and the working class masses, between the activity of an exclusive party and the broad struggle of the working class, end quote. But Martynov and his fellow economist Vladimir Makhnovets walked out after the Congress declined to recognize the Union of Russian Social Democrats abroad as a constituent organization, so neither Martynov nor Makhnovets were present when the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party split into two factions, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Later, Alexander Martynov joined the Mensheviks and was one of the faction's leading theorists. Trotsky described Alexander Martynov as the, quote, semi-official philosopher of Menshevist tactics, end quote. In January 1905, just before the start of the 1905 revolution, Alexander Martynov published an essay, Two Dictatorships, in which he forecast that the Russian autocracy was about to be overthrown and replaced by a, quote, bourgeois government, and argued that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, quote, is and should remain the party of the extreme opposition, unlike all other parties which can count on joining in the government of a bourgeois society, end quote. Alexander Martynov. Later in the year, Alexander Martynov acknowledged that there had been a, quote, tremendous explosion of working class resistance and only a, quote, timorous reaction from the bourgeoisie, but, quote, it does not at all contradict the fact that the present Russian Revolution is a bourgeois revolution, end quote. Alexander Martynov. Lenin's sarcastic response was that, quote, admirers of Martynov repeat the lessons of peaceful parliamentarism just at a time when, as they themselves state, actual hostilities have commenced. There is nothing more ridiculous than this pompous emphasis of the slogan, quote, extreme opposition, end quote, end quote. Returning to St. Petersburg late in summer 1905, Martynov took on the editorship of the newspaper Nachalo, and seeing how little the cadets were able to control events, Alexander Martynov concluded, quote, the Social Democrats alone have boldly raised the slogan of permanent revolution at the present time. They alone will lead the masses to the last and decisive victory. End quote. Quote, permanent revolution was a slogan used by Trotsky, who believed that the revolution would be led by the worker Soviets, but going back into exile after the revolution had been suppressed. Martynov disowned what he called this, quote, fantastic theory. Alexander Martynov was a member of the Menshevik Organization Committee from 1912 and supported the Menshevik Internationalists during the war, most of which he spent in Switzerland. Alexander Martynov returned to Russia by train with Julius Martov and others, and like Martov was one of the minority who opposed the war effort. Alexander Martynov was elected to the Menshevik Central Committee in December 1912, but Alexander Martynov broke with the party in 1918 during the Russian Civil War. After the introduction of the NEP, Alexander Martynov claimed that there no longer was an ideological difference between Alexander Martynov and the Soviet government. Alexander Martynov was admitted to the Communist Party in 1923 and loyally supported Joseph Stalin for the rest of his life. In the 1920s, Alexander Martynov worked as a researcher at the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute and a lecturer at the Communist Academy and the Sverdlov Communist University from 1924. Alexander Martynov worked for the Communist International. He became one of the Soviet Union's leading spokesmen on world communism. Alexander Martynov advocated for the Chinese Communist Party to subordinate itself to the Kuomintang until the debacle of the Guangzhou Uprising. In 1930, Alexander Martynov claimed that the rise of the Nazi Party was, quote, a necessary condition, end quote, for the, quote, decisive, end quote, victory of the workers' revolution. According to Nikolai Valentinov, who met Martynov in exile in Switzerland in 1904, Alexander Martynov was a fine raconteur. I don't know what the hell that means. Quote, no one could have imagined that this fat, unattractive-looking man with a lisp, who suffered from a dreadful form of eczema on his hands and head, had a tremendous gift of poetical description, end quote. He wrote, adding that he, quote, could not understand, end quote, how Martynov could have become a communist. Back to the text. Footnote. No footnote. The question had not been formulated in those words at the 1903 Congress. However, particularly after 1904, as Trotsky also noted, two opposed views were developing in the debate on the question. The representatives of the, quote, Jacobin wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, such as Lenin and Anatoly Lunacharsky, argued that Russia required not simply a repeat of 1789, but rather a, quote, bourgeois democratic, end quote, revolution without the bourgeoisie, under the leadership and in the interests of the proletariat. From this it followed that the task for the Russian Social Democrats, as Lunacharsky stressed in 1905, was to take from the great bourgeois revolutionaries not, quote, what had made them bourgeois revolutionaries, but what had made them great revolutionaries, end quote. Lunacharsky. The social democratic, quote, Girondists, on the other hand, who either, like Alexander Martynov, operated in the, quote, coordinates, end quote, of 1789, or like Irakli Tsereteli, strove for an eclectic synthesis of the experiences of 1789 and 1848, expected a revolution under the hegemony of the bourgeoisie. I'm just going to read the introduction from the Wikipedia for Tsereteli. Irakli Tsereteli lived from 1881 to 1959 and was a Georgian politician and a leading spokesman of the Social Democratic Party of Georgia and later Russian Social Democratic Labor Party during the era of the Russian revolutions. Tsereteli was born and raised in Georgia when it was part of the Russian Empire. A member of the Menshevik faction of the RSDLP, Tsereteli was elected to the Duma in 1907, where he gained fame for his oratorical skill. Shortly after entering the Duma, Tsereteli was arrested and charged with conspiracy to overthrow the Tsar's government and exiled to Siberia. A dedicated social democrat who believed in the Menshevik ideology, Tsereteli was one of the leading figures of the movement in Russia. In 1915, during his Siberian exile, Tsereteli formed what would become known as Siberian Simmervaldism, which advocated for the role of the Second International in ending the war. Irakli Tsereteli was also developed the idea of, quote, revolutionary defensism, the concept of a defensive war which only allowed for the defense of territory, and argued it was not being utilized. Returning to the government in the aftermath of the 1917 February Revolution, Tsereteli took up a leading position in the Petrograd Soviet and accepted a position in the Russian Provisional Government as Minister of Post and Telegraph and briefly as Minister of the Interior. Concerned that political fragmentation would lead to a civil war in Russia, Tsereteli strived to broker compromises between the various leftist factions in the Russian Revolution and was the force behind efforts to work together with the middle classes to no avail. Renowned for his speaking ability, Tsereteli gained appreciation for his ability in this regard, giving impassioned speeches in the Duma and in the Petrograd Soviet. After the Bolsheviks seized power over the Russian government during the October Revolution, Tsereteli returned to Russia. Tsereteli worked as a diplomat at the Paris Peace Conference, where he lobbied for international recognition and assistance for the newly independent Democratic Republic of Georgia. Meaningful assistance largely failed to materialize before the Bolshevik-led Red Army invaded in 1921. An avowed internationalist, Tsereteli grew increasingly distant from the Georgian Mensheviks, who gradually adopted more nationalist tendencies. Tsereteli spent the rest of his life, mainly in France, working with socialist organizations and writing on socialism, and died in New York City in 1959. Back to the text. For this reason, the workers had simply to play the role of a, quote, extreme opposition, end quote, as Pavel Axelrod, Ilya Serbaum Martov, and Georgy Plekhanov also agreed. This kind of understanding of revolution was characterized, as Trotsky said, quote, by extraordinary superficiality, and in the final analysis boiled down to crude historical analogies, end quote. Trotsky. The young Trotsky himself adopted a stance on this controversy which was little known at the Congress of 1903, but was original for all that. Trotsky's understanding of revolutionary history meant that he could transform the polemic between the, quote, Jacobins and the, quote, Girondists of Russian social democracy into a principled debate. Later, in 1906, Trotsky maintained that history did not repeat itself. Quote, however often the Russian Revolution is compared with the Great French Revolution, the Russian Revolution is far from being a simple repeat of the French Revolution, end quote. Thus it was a crude mistake, quote, to simply equate, bracket, the Russian Revolution, end bracket, with the events of 1789 to 1793, end quote, since the general sociological definition of, quote, a bourgeois revolution, end quote, could not replace the social analysis of a concrete historical situation. It was by no means an accident that a similar premise was also defended by Lenin, but as Trotsky considered in 1928, this is an expression of Lenin's approach towards the positions adopted by the radical wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in the years 1905 to 1907. However, considerable differences arose between the two thinkers even in the years of the First Russian Revolution, and not only in the year in which Trotsky's Our Political Tasks appeared, when, quote, the revolution for him was still largely a quote, theoretical abstraction, end quote, while Lenin had already and completely recognized its reality, end quote. Isaac Deutscher. Thus, Lenin had clearly preferred to proceed deductively and had formulated his hypothetical axioms, as Trotsky said, quote, largely to a deliberately algebraic character, end quote. Trotsky. The Permanent Revolution. Trotsky, on the other hand, drew his prognoses from an essentially inductive method of thought, in which the empirical historical analysis of the concrete Russian conditions took on primary significance. This sharply focused Trotsky's view of the peculiarities of the events in Russia, but also involved a danger of laying too much stress on the particular rather than the general in explaining the individual components of historical events. An almost perfect example of this was to be found in their attempts to characterize the major upheavals of the modern age. Lenin, who tried to deduce the specifics of 1789 and 1848 from the general tendencies of the revolutionary cycles in France, 1789 to 1871, and in Germany, 1848 to 71, believed that he had thereby found for Russia alternative routes to bourgeois revolution, a, quote, 1848 type or a, quote, 1789 type, end quote. Trotsky, on the other hand, strove by induction from the particular features of the events of 1789 and 1848 to abstract more precisely a typology of revolutionary significance for Russia. So Trotsky too suggested, quote, two opposed types, end quote, of revolution. But in Trotsky's case, there was, on the one hand, a type of revolution in which, quote, as shown between 1789 and 1793, end quote, quote, accounts were settled consistently with despotism by the powerful unity of the whole nation. The powerful unity of the whole nation, end quote. While on the other hand, there was a revolutionary model which had not yet been put to the test of history, in which the necessary energy for a radical overthrow of the ancien regime was tapped by, quote, an almighty development of the class struggle within the self-liberating nation, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky considered the, quote, 1848 type, which Lenin had thought relevant to Russia, to be the, quote, worst possible compromise, end quote. Trotsky. The raising of a single component in the revolutionary process to the level of a general criterion for a revolutionary typology, in the form of the mutual relationship between, quote, national and, quote, social, resulted in large part from an inductive way of thinking, and this also influenced the ideas of the young Trotsky on the character of Russian events. Whereas Lenin expected that the 1789 type of revolution would be more advantageous than the 1848 revolution for Russia, Trotsky accepted that Russian society would neither take the 1848 route nor experience a revolution of the 1789 type. For, as Trotsky said, as early as the middle of the 19th century, quote, the national task of political emancipation could not be resolved by the unanimous and homogeneous pressure of the whole nation, end quote. Trotsky. Such a stance also bore witness to the deep division between Trotsky and the, quote, Girondists, although the idea of, quote, national revolution was common to both. Thus, Martynov, referring to his, quote, two dictatorships, end quote, of 1907, stressed that the Russian Revolution could only be successful if, as in 1789, the social conflicts were not settled, quote, at the cost and expense of the unified national character of the revolution, end quote. Martynov. Trotsky, on the contrary, allowed the possibility of a revolution in Russia which would admittedly begin as a bourgeois revolution, but whose victory would only be achieved by social tensions reaching breaking point and the proletariat gaining dominance, that is, by overcoming the unified national character of the revolution. Amongst the advantages in Trotsky's thinking about the history of revolutions must be counted his attempt to deduce the peculiar character of Russian events in Russia from an analysis of the interconnectedness of industrial and social modernization in the country. Trotsky thereby arrived at the real theoretical nub of the controversy. This consisted in the concrete historical analysis of the relationship between the social forces involved at particular times and the task of the bourgeois revolution. In contrast to the Girondists, who thought they recognized the indicator for bourgeois dominance in the democratic task of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky was not satisfied with such, quote, formal logic. Rather, Trotsky tried to grasp the changes in the constellation of forces against the background of industrial development, not only between the social layers and classes, but also, like Karl Kautsky, within them. Trotsky considered the most important elements as follows. 1. The irrelevance of the urban craftsmen in Russia as a result of there being 4 million village, quote, Kustar craftsmen, when compared to the craftsmen in the revolutionary districts of Paris during the Great French Revolution, who constituted a majority. 2. The, quote, clear separate class of wage laborers, end quote, had replaced the urban craftsmen in the 20th century Russia as a result of the industrial factory system. These represented the, quote, core of the population of a modern town, end quote, and this undermined the democracy which had found, quote, the support of the urban petty bourgeoisie in earlier revolutions, end quote. 3. The Russian bourgeoisie, quote, small in numbers, isolated from, quote, the people, end quote, partly of foreign origin, without any historical tradition and only driven by the lust for profit, end quote, in Trotsky's view only resembled a caricature of the enlightened active bourgeoisie of heroic France, who had known how to, quote, make their revolution great, end quote. But in 1848 there was already the need for a, quote, class which was capable of mastering the advance without the bourgeoisie and indeed in opposition to them, end quote. Trotsky. However, since neither the urban petty bourgeoisie nor the peasantry were in a position to achieve this, in Trotsky's opinion it could only have been achieved by the proletariat. Quote, precisely this class, which was largely unknown at the time of the Great French Revolution, was to play the decisive role, end quote, in the Russian Revolution. However, it should be noted that Trotsky, in contrast to Lenin and Lenin's deductive method of thought, did not deduce the dominance of the proletarian elements in the democratic revolution in Russia a priori from his analysis of tendencies in European modernization and the assumption that a new revolutionary historical epoch had arrived. Rather, Trotsky considered the latter probably quite justifiably as the product of a specifically Russian constellation of forces, and this did not only involve the extremely limited social basis for democracy as a result of the significance of the urban petty bourgeoisie, in particular the dimensions and tempo of foreign investment, and the, quote, importance of foreign entrepreneurs for Russian absolutism had led, as the young Trotsky suggested, quoting the authority of Kautsky, a man of international reputation, to extraordinary disproportions in the growth in size, power and influence of the working class and of the bourgeoisie. Quote, the proletariat, end quote, wrote Trotsky in 1906, quote, suddenly found itself concentrated in enormous masses, and between it and absolutism stood only a numerically weak capitalist bourgeoisie. End quote. Trotsky. For Russia, one of the important questions in understanding the driving forces of the revolution concerns the role of the peasantry. Trotsky's differences with the, quote, Girondists, end quote, in this connection were less significant in the history of the development of theory than his difference of opinion with Lenin, although Trotsky later declared himself to be, quote, a pupil of Lenin since the autumn of 1902, end quote, on the question of the agrarian revolution. Footnote. Something in German. Sorry. End footnote. Thus Trotsky, quote, deviating from his, quote, teacher in his investigation of the emancipation of the Russian peasantry, did not proceed from Lenin's analogies with the revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries, but rather from the study of revolutions since 1789. Accordingly, the peasantry could indeed represent, quote, a rich seam of chaotic revolutionary power at a certain moment, end quote, but nonetheless it still handed over the revolutions of 1789 to 93 and 1848, quote, to the imperial or arch-absolutist reaction, end quote. Trotsky. The differences between the Russian Revolution and those of recent times was to be found less in the changed character of the peasantry than in the constellation of forces for the liberation of the peasantry and the forces emerging from this liberation. In 1789 and 1848, the, quote, emancipation of the peasantry, end quote, had been succeeded immediately by the coming to power of the moderate bourgeoisie. The liberated peasants, therefore, had lost their interest in the continuation of revolution in the towns. In Russia, however, the fate of, quote, the whole class of the peasantry, end quote, will be bound up, quote, with the fate of the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky. On finding itself in power, end quote, Trotsky wrote in 1906, quote, the proletariat will appear to the peasantry as the liberating class, end quote. Trotsky. This interpretation, debatable when judged against strict historical fact, also contained direct parallels between a, quote, bourgeois and a, quote, proletarian dictatorship over the peasantry. In contrast to the revolutions since 1789, which had been, quote, a history of the subjection of the country to the town, end quote. In Russia, all the positions of the bourgeoisie, including their, quote, revolutionary hegemony over the peasantry, end quote, would pass to the proletariat. Thus, there would be nothing left for the peasantry, quote, except to adhere to the regime of workers' democracy, end quote. By thus recognizing the changed relationship on the land, quote, during the first and most difficult period of the revolution, the Russian peasantry would have just as much interest in supporting the proletarian regime of, quote, workers' democracy, end quote, as the French peasantry had in supporting the military regime of Napoleon Bonaparte, which, with its bayonets, guaranteed to the new landowners the inviolability of their lands, end quote. From the logic, end quote, Trotsky. Therefore, it seemed to Trotsky in 1905 to 1906 that it was impossible to follow the social democratic, quote, Jacobins, who regarded the peasants as potential partners of the proletariat in the democratic revolution, and who designated it a, quote, peasant or, quote, agrarian revolution. Although Lenin considered that the tendency known since 1793 as the Vendée, I don't know if I'm saying that right. Let's look it up. French to English. Vendée, which is like a peasant revolt against the revolutionary government of France. Although Lenin considered the tendency known since 1793 as the, quote, Vendée would also apply to Russia, Lenin believed that the historical precedent for the emancipation of the Russian peasantry was to be found in the bourgeois revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries. But in these, quote, the peasantry had played an outstanding revolutionary role, end quote. Lenin. Therefore, the bourgeois revolution in Russia would necessitate the establishment of proletarian dictatorship in the form of a, quote, revolutionary workers' government, end quote. This idea met with incomprehension both among the, quote, Girondists, who, like Martov and Plekhanov, had demanded even in 1906 the institution of a bourgeois republic, and among the, quote, Jacobins, who, like Lenin and Stalin, believed in the goal of a, quote, democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote. According to Wikipedia, the Girondins were a political group during the French Revolution. From 1791 to 1793, the Girondins were active in the Legislative Assembly and the National Convention. Together with the Montagnards, the Girondins initially were part of the Jacobin movement. They campaigned for the end of the monarchy, but then resisted the spiraling momentum of the revolution, which caused a conflict with the more radical Montagnards. They dominated the movement until their fall in the insurrection of the 31st of May to the 2nd of June 1793, which resulted in the domination of the Montagnards and the purge and eventual mass execution of the Girondins. This event is considered to mark the beginning of the Reign of Terror. The Girondins were a group of loosely affiliated individuals rather than an organized political party, and the name was at first informally applied because the most prominent exponents of their point of view were deputies to the Legislative Assembly from the Département of Gironde in southwest France. Girondin leader Jacques-Pierre Brissot proposed an ambitious military plan to spread the revolution internationally. Therefore, the Girondins were the war party in 1792 to 1793. Other prominent Girondins include Jean-Marie Roland and his wife Madame Roland. They also had an ally in the English-born American activist Thomas Paine. Brissot and Madame Roland were executed, and Jean Roland, who had gone into hiding, committed suicide when he learned about the execution. Paine was imprisoned, but he narrowly escaped execution. The famous painting The Death of Marat depicts the fiery radical journalist and denouncer of the Girondins, Jean-Paul Marat, after being stabbed to death in his bathtub by Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer. Corday did not attempt to flee and was arrested and executed. Back to the text. These contradictory formulations of the question of power, which in Trotsky's view represented the, quote, main task of the revolution, end quote, formed the focal point for differences of opinion, and these culminated in the interpretation of Jacobinism, especially in the diverging positions on the French Convention. The quote Girondists such as Martinov regarded the Convention of the Jacobins, quote, as the revolutionary dictatorship of the most radical elements of the bourgeoisie at the birth of bourgeois society, end quote, in the 18th century. Where am I? After this revolutionary form of rule, there only remained the quote dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Martinov. But since Russia was not yet right for that, as the Caucasian Social Democrats stressed in 1905, or as Plekhanov suggested in Stockholm in 1906, then the workers should not repeat the Jacobin mistake by seizing power themselves or taking part in a revolutionary government. Georgy Plekhanov, the quote Nestor of Russian social democracy, end quote, who as author of the draft program of the 1903 London Congress, had managed to defend the quote dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, against all the reservations of Axelrod, Martov, and others, moved decisively away from this radical position 2 years later. Thus, at the Fourth Party Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in Stockholm in 1906, Plekhanov put forward the view that it was a question of seizing power by conspiracy, following on from the idea developed by Lenin, but not of, quote, seizing power in the way that the convention did in the French Revolution, end quote. Plekhanov. Wikipedia says the Fourth Unity Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party took place in the old Folkets Hus in Stockholm, Sweden, from the 23rd of April to the 8th of May, 1906. This Congress saw the formal, albeit short-living, reconciliation between the Bolshevik and Menshevik factions, hence the word, quote, unity in the Congress's name. The Congress was attended by 112 delegates with the right to vote, who represented 57 local party organizations and 22 delegates with voice but no vote. Other participants were delegates from various national social democratic parties, 3 each from the Social Democrats of Poland and Lithuania, the Bund, the Latvian Social Democratic Workers' Party, 1 each from the Ukrainian Social Democratic Labour Party and the Finnish Labour Party, and also a representative of the Bulgarian Social Democratic Workers' Party. Among the Bolshevik delegates were Vladimir Lenin, Alexander Bogdanov, Leonid Kazin, Mikhail Frunze, Mikhail Kalinin, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Anatoly Lunacharsky, Fyodor Sergeyev, Artyom Stepan Shah-Humyan, Ivan Skvortsov, Stepanov, Joseph Stalin, Clement Voroshilov, Maxim Litvinov, and V.V. Vorovsky. The main items on the Congress agenda were the agrarian question, an appraisal of the current situation and the class tasks of the proletariat, the attitude to the Duma, and organizational matters. There was a bitter controversy between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks over every item. Lenin made reports and speeches on the agrarian question, the current situation, and tactics regarding the Duma elections, the armed uprising, and other questions. The preponderance of Mensheviks at the Congress, while slight, determined its character. The Congress adopted Menshevik resolutions on a number of questions, the agrarian program, the attitude to the Duma, etc. The Congress approved the first clause of the rules concerning party membership in the wording proposed by Lenin. It admitted the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania and the Latvian Social Democratic Workers' Party into the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, and predetermined the admission of the Bund. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. The Congress elected the Fourth Central Committee made up of 3 Bolsheviks and 7 Mensheviks and a Menshevik editorial board of central body. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. Back to the text. Lenin argued against this. Quote, if you recognize the convention but rage against the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, then you are simply contradicting yourself, end quote. Lenin. The spokesman for the Jacobin wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party understood the convention of the year 1793 to be a, quote, dictatorship of the lower classes of the populace, end quote. According to them, there was an analogy between the historical precedent, quote, of a seizure of power of the convention type, end quote, and the, quote, dictatorship of the workers and peasants, end quote, in the idea of the, quote, conquest of power by the mass of the people, end quote. For them, however, the basic historical difference between the two lay in the fact that in Russia the leading role in the democratic revolution would be played not by the bourgeoisie but by the proletariat. They understood the Jacobin Convention of 1793 as a necessary substitute for the direct leadership of the bourgeoisie, but fulfilling its historic interests. Trotsky had made a similar, though essentially different point in 1905 to 1906 regarding the interpretation of the Jacobins, although even in 1903, the, quote, young neophyte of the new Iskraites, end quote, had comforted Akimov, Maknovitz, with the words, quote, he, Akimov, is afraid of the dictatorship of the proletariat since it is a Jacobin action. He forgets that this dictatorship would only become possible if the Social Democratic Party and the working class ... were to become virtually congruent, end quote. According to Wikipedia, Vladimir Petrovich Maknovitz lived from 1872 to 1921, also known as Akimov. Was a leader of the Russian Social Democrats. Maknovitz was born in 1872 in Voronezh and studied in St. Petersburg. In 1890, Akimov participated in revolutionary groups, first with the Narodnik, then the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. Akimov was arrested and deported to Siberia in April 1898. In September 1898, Akimov escaped and fled to Geneva. There he joined the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad and became one of the editors of its magazine Robochaya Delo. Akimov then formed a faction opposed to the group that would soon establish the Iskra paper, and Georgy Plekhanov and Vladimir Lenin. Along with Alexander Martynov, Vladimir Maknovitz represented the economist trend of the Second Congress in 1903. Vladimir Maknovitz's faction was defeated at the Congress by the majority of the Iskra. However, at the majority split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, Vladimir Maknovitz's faction joined forces with the Mensheviks of Martov. In 1905, Vladimir Maknovitz's published a polemical history of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In the following year, he aligned with the right wing of the Mensheviks. Vladimir Makhnovitz returned illegally to England in 1905 during the Revolution and joined the Cardwainer trade union, which enabled him to participate in the St. Petersburg Soviet. That sentence doesn't make sense. Again, view these Wikipedia articles with a grain of caution. At the Fourth Congress of the party in 1906, Vladimir Makhnovitz spoke against an armed uprising and in general opposed insurrection as a means of achieving socialism. Instead, Vladimir Makhnovitz stated that the Social Democrats should support the Liberals, cadets in the elections for the State Duma. Vladimir Makhnovitz maintained this position in the 1912 elections and was criticized by other militants like Lenin. In 1911, Vladimir Makhnovitz was jailed for his text Cutting Heads, which was published in 1908. However, Vladimir Makhnovitz was successful in escaping exile. Vladimir Makhnovitz returned to Russia after the 1913 amnesty. Vladimir Makhnovitz died in Zenigorod, Moscow Oblast, in November 1921. The two major works of Akimov, Vladimir Makhnovitz, have not been republished since 1969. Back to the text. Accordingly, the proletarian dictatorship was not to be seen as a conspiratorial, quote, seizure of power, but rather as the form of rule of the workers who form the majority of the nation. This Jacobin conception, colored by historical distance, scarcely provides evidence of David Ryazdanov's version of an incarnation of Trotsky as, quote, Lenin's cudgel at the Second Party Congress of 1903. Rather, this Jacobin conception anticipated the text Our Political Tasks of the following year, in which Trotsky warned against superficial analogies and distanced himself from, quote, Jacobinism, as well as from the general outlook of, quote, Maximilian Lenin, end quote. But it appears that by 1905 to 1906, Trotsky had already forgotten these thoughts, although the Social Democrats and the workers had not got anywhere close to congruence, nor had the latter formed the majority of the, quote, nation. Unlike Plekhanov's change of stance, the direct participation of Trotsky as chairman of the Council of Workers' Deputies in the revolutionary events in St. Petersburg in 1905 had apparently contributed to a radicalization of Trotsky's position. Thus, Trotsky evaluated the, quote, Girondist plea for the non-participation of the Social Democrats in a provisional government as, quote, a betrayal of the cause of the revolution, end quote. Trotsky's apology for proletarian dictatorship now determined more than ever his interpretation of the French Convention. Trotsky saw in this the historical example, quote, of political rule by the Russian working class, end quote. Unlike the Social Democratic, quote, Jacobins, who perceived, quote, a government of the working masses, end quote. For the convention was certainly, quote, formally, a national representative body composed of Jacobins, Girondists, and a massive swamp, but basically was a Jacobin dictatorship. Accordingly, there was no possible question of, quote, some special form of proletarian dictatorship within the framework of the bourgeois revolution, end quote, nor even, as Lenin proposed, quote, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote. It remains to be noted on the history of the interpretation of the French Revolution that Trotsky certainly did not expect a revolution, quote, of this type, end quote, in Russia, but proposed historical parallels between the convention and his concept of a, quote, workers' government. This raises the question of whether there was here one interpretation of 1789 and another of 1793, that is, an ascent, quote, de-Jacobinization, end quote, of the French Revolution. Since, quote, the Jacobin sans-culotte terrorist democracy of Robespierre in the year 1793, end quote, was assessed as a phenomenon of developing bourgeois democracy, there can be no talk of a, quote, de-Jacobinization, end quote. Trotsky. Rather, Trotsky's concepts were colored both by the analogy between Jacobin dominance and revolutionary, quote, workers' democracy, end quote, to the left of the liberal bourgeoisie, and by considerations of historical distance. On the one hand, Trotsky in his youthful optimism proceeded from the belief that the workers' movement had, quote, long ago put its historical reckoning with Jacobinism behind it. That is, it had quote, subjected, bracket, Jacobinism, end bracket, to a theoretical criticism, end quote, recognizing its utopian phraseology and broken with its tradition. But, on the other hand, the proletariat had undertaken to protect, quote, Jacobinism against, quote, all attacks, slanders, and crude insults, end quote. The heart of the workers believed Trotsky beat, quote, in full sympathy for the words and deeds of the Jacobin Convention, end quote. Trotsky. Within this framework, Trotsky summarized that the historical parallels between Jacobin rule and revolutionary, quote, workers' democracy, end quote, consisted in the substitution of bourgeois hegemony. But he saw the crucial difference as the fact that in 1793, this substitution was carried forward by the, quote, terrorist dictatorship of the victorious sans-culottes, end quote, i.e., principally by the urban petty bourgeoisie, whereas in Russia the industrial proletariat formed the main mass of the urban populace. Urban population.
Sans culotte. Sans culotte.
Sans culotte. Sans culotte. Quote, just this analogy alone, end quote, wrote Trotsky in 1908, quote, points to the possibility of such a historical situation in which the victory of the, quote, bourgeois, end quote, revolution would only be achieved by the proletariat, end quote. Know that at least for the initial period of the Russian Revolution, it would be a question of a substitution and not of a historically determined removal of bourgeois hegemony by the workers. Trotsky adduced as a reason for this the fact that, even under proletarian guidance, there would at first be problems of a democratic nature to be resolved, and there would be the danger that, quote, the proletariat would be toppled by a coalition of the bourgeois classes, including the very peasantry which had been liberated by the proletariat, end quote. And thus, quote, the revolution would be halted at its limited bourgeois phase, end quote. This excursion into the history of the social thought of Russian social democracy shows that the young Lev Davidovich Trotsky in the first decade of the 20th century adopted an independent stance in the decisive controversy between the, quote, Jacobins and, quote, Girondists on the question of modern revolutions as they affected Russia. Trotsky's position was different both from Lenin's and from that of the Mensheviks. We can see three broad phases in the genesis of his understanding of the revolutions. 1. On the eve of the Russian events of 1905, Trotsky still understood the revolution generally as a, quote, theoretical abstraction, end quote. Trotsky turned decisively against superficial analogies, since these distorted historical truth. In, quote, Jacobinism, a central subject in the argument, Trotsky perceived a limited bourgeois, quote, utopia condemned to failure, end quote, which permitted no parallels with Russia. Characteristic here also were the reservations Trotsky expressed on the proletarian dictatorship proclaimed by the Jacobin wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. 2. In the revolutionary years 1905 to 07, there was a clear rapprochement with the radical positions of the Social Democratic, quote, Jacobins. At the center of his increased preoccupation with historical experiences stood the analysis of the function of the driving forces and forms of rule in the period of the smashing of the Ancien regime. The axioms formulated at this time culminated in the polemic against the conceptions of the, quote, Girondists. Unlike Lenin, however, Trotsky preferred induction as the instrument of an attempted revolutionary typology. This sharpened his division of the peculiarities of Russian events, but involved a danger of overemphasizing particular factors. Characteristic of this could also have been the conception of permanent revolution. This led, amongst other determining social factors, to the expectation of a rising curve in the course of the revolution, similar to that of 1789. In this respect, the premises of Trotsky and Lenin diverged markedly. With one, it was, quote, the proletarian 1789, with the other, the, quote, proletarian peasant 1793, end quote. 3. After the events of 1905, Trotsky's analysis of revolutions again took in the year 1794, but in contrast to Trotsky's pre-1905 studies, Trotsky now considered, quote, Thermidor as a conceivable, quote, bourgeois counter-revolution, end quote, for Russia as well. The, quote, revolution in permanence, end quote, now included not only mutatis mutandis, the year 1789 to 1793, but also the year 1794. So we see here the beginnings of the ideas on Thermidor, which later appeared more pronounced in Trotsky's opposition to Stalin. Where am I? Sorry, I lost my spot. It was this theoretical analysis of revolutions which explains why Trotsky, after the defeat of the revolution of 1905, wanted an end to the polemic between, quote, Jacobins and, quote, Girondists, and sought a compromise. The social democratic Girondists, who warned against a, quote, Russian 1793, precisely because of the possibility of a, quote, 1794, remained in the historical, quote, coordinates of 1789 to 1792, while Lenin and Lenin supporters certainly preferred the Jacobin year 1793 for Russia, but closed their eyes to a 1794. Nevertheless, it was precisely, quote, Thermidor, which became the fateful question of the Russian Revolution. That's the end of this article. Thank you so much for listening.